Hi everyone! Have you ever thought you were winning, then suddenly out of nowhere get brilliantly outplayed by the most brutal, unexpected sacrifice of all? Well, I assure you that a man named Johannes Zukertort pulled off exactly this kind of madness against Joseph Blackburne in 1883, and today we're going to walk you through exactly how he did it. So Zukertort starts things off with pawn to c4, that's the English opening, and Black responds with pawn to e6, which is kind of signaling something like the Agincourt defense. Now, I'll be honest, that's not something I'm super familiar with, and it's not really a common line you see these days, but it can definitely lead into something like a queen's gambit with just a couple more moves. In this game, though, that's not what happens. After pawn to e6, white plays pawn to e3. So these two pawn moves, e3 and e6, they're basically telling you that both queen bishops are probably going to get fianchettoed, because moving along that long diagonal isn't really going to be in the cards for either of those bishops at this point. You can kind of see it coming already, and sure enough, that's exactly what we get in this game. But let's keep going with the development. Knight f6, knight f3, b6, and then bishop to e2, which is a pretty modest square for this bishop. You could also imagine something like d4 first, and then deploying that bishop to d3. Interestingly, we actually do see that idea on the black side a bit later, but first we get bishop to b7, white castles kingside, and now pawn to d5. What Black's doing here is planning to put that bishop on d6, where it'll eventually help support a pawn to e5 push, and so at this moment, White establishes that pawn in the center with d4, and Black continues with bishop to d6, keeping an eye on that e5 advance. The queen might land on e7 at some point to support this plan, but in this particular game, we never actually see that e5 push happen. Instead, knight to c3, and Black continues pawn to b3, so the queen bishop gets fianchettoed here for White. Knight to d7, more pieces coming out, and this knight is actually keeping watch on those c5 and e5. You could very well see one of those pawn breaks in this kind of structure, hitting at White's central pawn on d4. Bishop to b2, and now this next move by Black, queen to e7, this is a pretty significant commitment at this stage, because there's really not much imbalance in the position yet when you look at the pawn structure. I mean, the pawn formations are almost identical, except for the c-pawns. White's pushed theirs to c4, and Black's is still sitting on c7. Everything else is basically the same. So after queen to e7, White answers with knight to b5. And what's about to happen here is one of those key imbalances you get in chess games, a knight for bishop trade that really can't be avoided. If the bishop moves away, you can always question that, so this exchange is definitely happening. Black must have anticipated this and figured they'd be able to use that imbalance to their advantage. Maybe they were thinking they could make good use of their knight and try to limit that dark-squared bishop's influence. So we get knight e4, knight takes bishop, and now pawn takes knight. So even though these pawns look doubled, and that's just kind of on paper, this is going to get resolved pretty quickly. This exchange right here basically can't be stopped. Actually, this pawn on e4 is going to play a useful defensive role, controlling that e5 square, so you can forget about White planting a knight there. Plus, now the c-file is opening up for Black rooks, or at least it's going to be a natural thing to bring those rooks to that file at some point.
So c takes d, and now knight to d2. Now this is definitely one of those moments in a game where you've got to come up with an actual plan, and that's not always the simplest thing to figure out. Once you're past the opening phase and you've gotten your pieces developed, this middle game planning phase is really where you need to focus. White's moving ahead with the idea of eliminating Black's one piece that's crossed over to the white side of the board, that knight on e4, so challenging it immediately. This knight to d2 move makes a lot of sense, because really, what's the future for that knight on f3? It can't use e5, there's no way to influence that pawn's position, no way to kick it away from defending e5, so the best option is probably knight to d2 just to challenge that e4 knight. That's a good role for the knight, get rid of Black's advanced piece. After knight to d2, Black wants to keep that square secure, and White pushes pawn to f3, taking control of e4. Knight takes knight is basically forced here, because otherwise that knight's getting trapped. If it goes to g5, it's clearly running out of room after pawn to h4. So knight takes knight, queen takes knight, pawn takes, and then bishop takes. Now, it might be tempting to want to capture toward the center and build a pawn center like that, but it's definitely not without giving black some pressure on this pawn, because now black has this file that was opened, and now it's kind of half open with a white pawn on it, and this could become a target with moves like doubling rooks or bishop to a6 or well-timed d5 advances. You might even see d5 right away. So just to avoid any potential issues with having that white pawn on the c-file, the bishop just recaptures, and now black moves ahead with pawn to d5. This is actually a pretty solid pawn structure for black, forcing the bishop to move. Where does it go? Bishop to d3, the best spot, now looking to get in that e4 advance. In the meantime, what does black do? Rook from f8 to c8. I'm not totally sure if there's a huge difference between which rook goes to the c-file here. Sometimes I really like to ask why this rook and not the other one. I'm not certain there's a massive difference in this case, but either way, the f rook went to c8. This is the only open file right now, and usually in a chess game when there's only one open file, you'll often see both rooks eventually getting traded off, and maybe even the queens. But in this game, that's not what happens at all, which makes it really interesting. Actually, right now, if you want to pause and think about it, in this position, which rook do you think white would be bringing to the c-file? Or maybe better yet, what move do you think was actually played here? Feel free to pause and see if you can work it out. Alright, so it's actually neither rook going to c1, but instead rook a to e1. This might seem a little odd at first, because black can now double on the c-file, and that's exactly what happens with rook to c7. But what's that rook on e1 doing? It's supporting the e4 pawn advance. White's seeing that black can make these moves that position the rooks on nice-looking squares, but what are they actually accomplishing beyond looking pretty? That's all they're doing right now, because there are no real entry points. You know, if you're going to control an open file in chess, the next thing you want to do is get your rook to the second rank or the back rank. But there are no good entry points here for black at all. All these squares are covered by the bishops alone, and it's not inconvenient at all for the bishops to be positioned like this. They're doing good work, particularly that bishop on d3 for now, watching over e4.
So with this e4 advance, with white pushing forward, it starts becoming really tough for black to deal with the eventual advance of the e and f pawns, looking to create more open files on those files. Meanwhile, these two rooks on c7 and c8, they look fine, but they're not really doing much of anything productive. After pawn to e4, we get black doubling and e5. There's really no way to keep that knight where it is no matter how you slice it. If black hadn't doubled and had captured on e4 instead, well, now we've got play along the f-file. Black would be dealing with maybe a timely pawn takes on f6, queen coming out. All sorts of bad things could happen if black takes on e4 first, because you're giving white two different pawns that could potentially move forward, and defending against two possibilities is even harder. So black just doubles on the c-file, and white pushes pawn to e5, kicking the knight away. The best defensive square, that f6 square, but the knight has to go somewhere else, so it goes to e8. White keeps pressing with pawn to f4, looking to get it to f5, and black quickly stops it with pawn to g6. But right now, instead of pushing immediately, we get a rook lift, so not playing f5 just yet. Maybe there were thoughts of pawn to g4 and then f5, but this rook lift is definitely very forcing, looking to swing over to the h-file or maybe even the g-file. Who knows, maybe getting that queen to h6 and looking for mate. Black's feeling the pressure at this point and makes some lateral defense for the king, maybe trying to shut down the bishop's diagonal with this next move, pawn to f5. White definitely wants to keep things open and captures en passant. You really want to open that file, keep the diagonal open, so capturing is absolutely the way to go. Pawn takes on f6, knight takes, and now more files and diagonals are opening up. When you're the side with the bishop pair, trading pawns is going to open up more diagonals for you. We now have this diagonal opening for the queen, and this is really the last piece that needs to get active on white's side. With pawn to f5, if the pawn takes, we could have the rook or bishop capturing because of the pin on the e-file. After pawn to f5, the knight plants itself on e4, and finally this bishop is showing up more in the position, since it's indirectly watching e4. This piece is essentially intolerable. Earlier we saw white get rid of black's e4 knight with knight to d2, and now the other one's planted there and it gets removed quickly. bishop takes, pawn takes bishop, and now pawn takes on g6. So right here, and this is maybe some of what makes this game known as Zukertort's Immortal, it's the depth of calculation at this point. It's knowing exactly what to do 5 moves down the line from this position. There are a couple bombs that are about to get dropped here in just a moment. This is a really critical point where serious calculation was needed. Moving forward, pawn takes on g6, and now rook to c2. Definitely strong calculation was needed here, hitting both queen and bishop. If the queen moves right now, that bishop is just dead, so we don't get that yet. Instead, pawn takes on h7 with check first, and the king goes to the corner. This is pretty typical in chess. The king avoids taking that pawn to use it as a bit of shelter, kind of hiding behind the white pawn for defense. Otherwise, we'd have rook to h3 check and all that. So king to h8, and now, instead of reacting to the rook threat on the queen, white plays pawn to d5, and we've got a discovered check on the king. Black shuts down that diagonal with e5. And now here comes the really interesting, brilliant move. If you want to pause and try to find white's next move, go ahead.
Okay, the move is queen to b4. This is the first of what I'd say are a couple spectacular moves here, offering the queen basically in exchange for the black king, because if black takes the queen at this point, it's mate in 7. Now, this wasn't played in the game, but let's look at what that mate in 7 would look like. It starts with bishop takes on e5 check. King takes on h7 is the only move. Rook to h3. If the king goes to g8, it's immediate mate. The best resistance is king to g6, rook to f6, and if the king goes to g5, we'd have check, check, and wherever the king goes, the bishop delivers check. If it goes to h4, it's mate, and in the other direction, we'd have check first and then mate. Another line after that first check would be after rook to f6, and if king to g7, we'd have rook check. If the king goes to h8, it's quick mate, and if the king goes to a light square, we give check, king is forced to one square, check again, and finally mate. However you look at it, it's going to be mate if white's queen gets captured in this position. So instead, we get rook to c5, and white follows up with another spectacular move, rook to f8, diverting the queen away from defending that h7 pawn. If queen takes rook here, we get bishop takes on h7, king takes, queen takes, and this leads to quick mate. If king here, then we could have queen to g6 and mate next move, or if the king goes here, mate's coming very quickly. This is one way to finish the game. Actually, there are like 4 different mates from this position. Take your pick. That wasn't the line that was played though. After rook to f8 check, we just have king takes on h7, and the queen could take on e4 with check, king to g7, and the game wraps up nicely. Although there was actually a faster way to win, I'll show that, but in the actual game, we had bishop takes, king takes rook, bishop to g7 trying to push the king away from defending the queen. If king takes, we're just grabbing that queen. And if queen takes bishop, we'd have a really nice mate on e8. But how the game actually finished, bishop to g7, king to g8, queen takes queen, and black ended up resigning. What an incredible game. Before you go, drop a comment, as I'd love to know who's watching and learning from these games. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this analysis, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. See you in the next one.